Hi everyone. It looks like it's 1:30 now, so I think we should start. Thanks to those of you who are joining this webinar. There's just a few comments that I need to make at the beginning, just to introduce the webinar itself. And then I'll also introduce the content of the webinar that Pascal and myself will be introducing. So firstly, thanks for joining. This is the EOSC Governance Development Forum webinar. So it's a part of a series of webinars that the EOSCpilot project runs. And today, this webinar is the one that's about the recommendations on a minimal set of EOSC rules of participation. So that's the theme of this particular webinar. It will be given by myself, Andrew Smith. I'm Head of External Relations at ELIXIR, and Pascal Kahlem.
I'm the training platform coordinator at ELIXIR.
And Pascal and I have been working on these recommendations for rules of participation in EOSC, but we've also had a lot of support and help from colleagues as well in other parts of the EOSC project. So we'll start by thanking their contributions. So the co-leader of this task is Donatella Castelli from CNR and her group. So several of her group and CNR have been helping with this. And also Damien Lecompentier from CSC, who's involved in another EOSCpilot work package and has also been working very closely to help develop these rules of participation. So that's where this sits. The webinar is part of a bigger series. This is looking at the rules of participation, and it's specific to the EOSCpilot project. The other thing I'll mention at the beginning is that we will aim to spend about 30 to 40 minutes, no more than that, on these slides. There is a chat function which we encourage you to use, because when the webinar is finished, we would like to be able to answer your questions as well. So using this webinar system, you must use the chat function to ask your question. And then Pascal and I will review these as we go through the slides, and we'll finish by trying to answer some of those questions. So please use the chat function. There is another function called Q&A, but we won't be using that system to respond to questions. So you must use chat function, and we'll try and address them at the end of the webinar. Okay, so hopefully that's all clear. Let me just move to explain a bit of the context to the project. So I move now to the background. So the aim of the task that we had in the EOSCpilot project was about trying to identify and propose a preliminary set of rules of participation for service providers and users to the European Open Science Cloud. So several work packages within the EOSCpilot project have been involved in this deliverable. So it's really been a joint effort, and I've thanked the people that have helped us with this. So it also relates to tasks around the governance structure of EOSC, which is also work package 2 of the EOSC pilot project. But it's also had a lot of input from some of the technical architecture side from work package 5, particularly around the service management framework as well. So this is the work that Damien in particular has done. And there's obviously a lot of complementarity about the rules of participation and the overall governance and business models work of work package 2, as well as the work that's being done on policies in work package 3. So although we've been leading this task, we have had a lot of input from colleagues in other parts of the EOSCpilot project. And later on in a moment, I'll also set out some of the external input that we've had through the various consultations. So we very much seen this deliverable as the first iterative step. The EOSCpilot project was really the first effort to try and make a set of recommendations. And we very much hope that they will be picked up by other projects over time. EOSC Hub, the high-level expert group, is making recommendations on this. The European Commission is. So we really see this deliverable that has now been submitted as the first step for other parts of the community to pick up, improve, and adapt over time. So that's the context to this. The next slide really explains the process that we went through. And I've just got a few slides to explain this before Pascal will start explaining the recommendations in a bit more detail so you can see them and so on. So we really started this piece of work by trying to analyze existing organizations, projects, research infrastructures, and community initiatives that had similar types of rules. And the purpose of this was to try and help us define what the scope of the rules should be. If you set barriers that are too high, it makes it very difficult for service providing organizations to adopt those. Therefore, the EOSC itself that is built is more restrictive in scope. And so that was really what we were trying to do in this landscape analysis. It was to consult the community, initiatives that already exist, and find out what rules govern their own internal processes to make sure that we were aware of the bigger picture when we went about making our initial recommendations. So we divided this work into several phases. Phase 1, which I'll come back to in more detail in my next slide, was really to start by looking at existing e-infrastructures, existing domain-specific research infrastructures. It was also looking at some commercial cloud providers as well, because we think it's important not just to make sure that the rules work for the e-infrastructures and domain-specific research infrastructures like S3s, but also to have space for commercial providers as well. And then we looked at some of the other initiatives that are set up on the back of principles and charters as well, so more community-driven initiatives. Phase 2, which ran from July to September last year, was really then about analysing these in much more detail. So phase 1 was more like a high-level helicopter view. Phase 2 was having more in-depth interviews and analysis of the rules that relate to those individual organisations. So looking at the e-infrastructures, what rules govern the services that they provide, looking at the domain-specific research infrastructures, and seeing what rules govern the services that they provide to users as well. So that was all the initial research work that led us up until a point where we felt that we were able to start to condense this into a set of draft recommendations. And at that point, we started to communicate, to consult wider communities through events. So sometimes linked to presidency events, sometimes EOSC governance meetings as well. And so we presented and had discussions at various workshops, Tallinn, 2 in Brussels, including a large panel discussion at the one of the EOSC stakeholder forum meetings, and then in Porto and Pisa earlier this year. Then we also sought external input. So the draft was shared with the European Commission and other large cluster projects that represent large communities as well, when the recommendations were rather firm. So I think we've done quite a lot of effort to try and make sure that the principles and recommendations that we've put forward are based on what the existing rules are for current infrastructures. If you remember, we mentioned in the first phase how we did desk-based research to begin with. And these are some of the ideas of the organizations that we looked at to try and analyze and study what rules govern how they provide services to users at the moment. We looked at the e-infrastructures like Géant, EGI, Prace. We looked externally to the US at the NIH Cloud Data Commons. We also looked within Europe at the pre-commercial activities of the Helix Nebula Cloud as well. We looked at EUDAT and OpenAir as well. So we did a lot of work with e-infrastructures. We then looked at several of the domain-specific research infrastructures across different disciplines and domains. We also spoke to AWS and Google Cloud Platform as well, and then some of the more community-driven initiatives, which will have their own charters and rules around how they operate, things like the RDA and the data seal of approval. We worked to try and understand what rules and processes that they had in place when it came to how that should operate as well. So that reached a point when we were able to start by making our first set of recommendations. And at this point, I'll pass to Pascal, who will introduce the principal recommendations that we've made.
Thank you, Andrew. So the main rule of participation that we defined was that for all EOSC service providers, EOSC services should be registered in an EOSC compliant and compatible service catalog visible to the global EOSC gateway. So the rationale behind this is supporting inclusiveness, transparency, and it enables standardization and interoperability of services. In the EOSC compatible catalogs, the registered services must be described according to the appropriate EOSC service guidelines, which could include information such as the service availability, functionalities, operations, maturity, user support, interoperability, openness, privacy, terms of use, and contractual framework. So in addition to this main rule of participation, we have had to propose specifications that would allow to adapt the rules to specific domains of scientific domains. And these specifications need to adapt to the dynamic ecosystem of services, which are very diverse. Users and the EOSC governance want to be informed about a service, and therefore we need to find a way to provide specifications about the services, such as the service availability, the functionalities, maturity, support, the terms of use, contractual framework, among others. And another question that we needed to be able to specify with the rules is the value of the services. For example, the quality and the performance of the service, the sustainability, the access policies, data portability, the compatibility, and so on. So we, with these requirements in mind, we have proposed 7 specific requirements that can be added to the main rule of participation, depending on the context and depending on the scientific domain that we are looking at. The first specificity is to use machine-readable metadata. All services must be described in a machine-readable format and be identifiable by means of a common and persistent identification. So minimal information must be provided to the catalogs according to the specifications of the EOSC catalog, and they must accommodate specificities of the corresponding communities to allow users to assess operational and functional aspects of the service providers. For example, the quality indicators, fare indicators, and licenses. The second specificity is the terms of use, or the access policies. So we propose that all EOSC services must have terms of use and access policies displayed publicly online and via the EOSC catalogs. The third specification is about accessibility. The EOSC service providers must describe how they ensure accessibility and interoperability and provide information in the EOSC compatible service catalog where they registered their service. For example, on their metadata, APIs, and protocols. The fourth specification is the portability. We propose that the legal and technical infrastructure should enable the portability of data and services. Service providers, for example, for a tool service provider, should enable the deployment and execution of their service by users in any compatible cloud instance. A fifth specification is concerning the access cost and charging model. And we propose that service providers may apply user charges and fees, which could vary by type of service provider, and location of users. But this information must be made clear to users online and via the appropriate EOSC service catalog. Underlying cost could be also indicated. For data-related services, for service providers, could indicate maintenance costs, for example, or curation or stewardship costs. But these should be made publicly clear and available and accessible. The sixth specification concerns quality of service. Service providers should conform to the quality guidelines that are being developed within EOSC. Services that provide excellence-based access, for example, EGI, where research groups are allocated resources based on competitive processes, should operate with transparent expert peer review. And the last specification is the relation to users. Specific providers should be transparent about data management mechanisms they use to store or process or publish content. If applicable, service providers must publicly indicate if they provide the users with the means to apply fair principles to research data. They must publicly indicate if they offer the mechanisms and list them to ensure sustainability and reproducibility of data. Third, they must publicly disclose details on what data about users is collected and how the user statistics is tracked, managed, and used for service improvement. Fourth, the service providers must publicly indicate if they offer the mechanisms to apply data protection rules according to the General Data Protection Regulation, especially in terms of data protection by design and data protection by default using relevant shields and information. And finally, all services must be accompanied by corresponding support and training material and possibly a help desk. And all these should ensure transparency and openness regarding the relation to users. We have also developed another type of rules which concerns the core services of EOSC. What are the core services? There is a definition that has been proposed, which is the core resources of EOSC are the sets of services and processes that are needed to integrate and enable access to the various resources federated in the EOSC. In other words, the core resources are services that are relied on for EOSC operations. For example, central AAI, service registry, monitoring, help desk, services enabling users' feedback, and others. And so for these core resources, we may have to adopt stricter standards or service requirements. They may have to be reviewed by EOSC level criteria, specific bodies such as a scientific advisory board or bodies included through the service level agreements with the European Commission. They may have to use the appropriate standards of a particular community, a domain, or ISO standards relevant to specific fields or services. And they may even have to require certification of compliance to EOSC if this is required by the EOSC governance. So we will not go more into the details of rules for core services because this would have to be set by the EOSC governance in the next future steps of the EOSC development. Another set of rules of participation concerns the users. And we could have set various rules of participations, but we finally considered that the rules of participations for users may be framed within the terms of use presented by the service providers for each service. And therefore, we are proposing some rules here, but they may be picked up by the terms of use of each service provider. The first rule concerns data sharing and sustainability. And we have here two proposals. The first one is that in domains where community recognized data repositories exist, users should be encouraged to deposit their data in these data repositories in the first instance. Another rule is that users would be recommended to publish their data in a fair format and, if applicable, an open format. And the second set of rules is concerns the acknowledgement of use of EOSC services. If requested by terms of use of a service provider, then the user should acknowledge through citing in publications or other means the service that have been accessed through EOSC that have enabled the research. So this is the last rule of participation for users. And when the European Commission published the implementation roadmap of EOSC in March 2018, we re-evaluated the alignment of the proposed rules of participation with this implementation roadmap. And I will not go through the details of this slide, but you can access it afterwards offline. We wanted to show that all the statements that are proposed in the implementation roadmap are addressed by the rules that we have proposed. And so we feel that that the rules of participation that we have proposed are fully aligned with the implementation roadmap of the European Commission for EOSC. So this is where I call in Andrew to present the conclusions.
Yes. Okay, thanks Pascal for introducing the recommendations for principles for service providers and users. We just wanted to conclude really, but just by just pulling it all together and then just explaining what the next steps were in this process. So as I'm sure you've seen, the rules that we've set forward, we wanted to try and embrace the principles of openness, transparency, and inclusiveness. It would be quite easy for us to have come up with a long list of what we think service providers should do to run a service in the context of the EOSC, but I don't think that would have been right. So what we tried to do was consult widely and try to come up with a minimal set of rules wherever possible that would make the EOSC far more inclusive and open, which is, I think, the key to its success. So that's really the approach that we've tried to take when we've been coming up with these recommendations. And hence, the main recommendation is that EOSC services shall be registered in an EOSC compliant or compatible service catalogue visible to the EOSC gateway. The wording of this also takes into account the fact that there are many different registries that already exist in different communities and domains. There are different entry points to access the services. We don't think the ecosystem will be based just on, or it should be based on just one single entry point, because in many domains, users are already accessing services that would be part of the European Open Science Cloud once it's fully operational. And so hence that's why the wording around this is about EOSC compliant registries. Then we complement this with these 7 specific rules, which apply to certain scientific communities and services. We don't think that they're restrictive. We've tried to be very inclusive when coming up with them. And also, as Pascal mentioned, we reviewed against the Commission's own recommendations through its implementation roadmap as well, where it made some statements about its own rules of participation. So that's why we think they fully align with those. And what we hope is that the work that we and our colleagues have done on the principles of engagement will really help to take forward the discussions in the next stages of the EOSC Hub project, which also has tasks to do this. You would have probably seen that the high-level expert group has had a consultation over summer where they've been asking for community input, because they also have a task to come up with a set of recommendations for principles of engagement. And we expect the Commission itself will probably make a set of recommendations for principles of engagement as well. So set in that context, ours was really the first work to try and get the ball rolling, to come up with a minimal set that people can pick apart, improve, and take forward once EOSC itself becomes fully operational. And that's why Pascal's points in the middle about how we also have a separate set of suggested principles for the core services. So once it's decided what the core service is, whether there's a single AAI that will apply, a central registry, service help desk. So once those decisions are taken as to which services will be set up, new services, central services that the EOSC will be set up, then we think there'll need to be a higher level of rules that would apply to those. So that's where I'll wrap up the presentation itself. Just to finish by acknowledging again all of the authors and contributors to this, so colleagues within ELIXIR, but also colleagues from CNR, Donatella's group, and from CSC, so Damien's work, including on the EOSC Hub project, has been really helpful, but also the contributions from other EOSCpilot work packages as well, because in parallel, we've all been working on our own tasks and deliverables, which have interdependencies between themselves. So you can't make a final set of recommendations on principles for engagement before you also understand opportunities for business models or what the governance forum will work like. And so in parallel, there's been lots of tasks and crossover work to try and make sure this is aligned. So a big thanks to colleagues on the EOSCpilot project for helping with this. And then finally, all of the slides that we presented are of course based on the deliverable report, which was submitted and approved earlier in the summer. And so we've embedded a link to this if you want to read the full deliverable report itself. And you can get that via this link. And of course, there'll be some follow-on events where we'll be present as well. So Pascal will be at the DI4R, the Digital Infrastructures for Research conference in Lisbon next month.